I'm come from the field of post-colonial studies, and the theoretical framework that I used was the decoloniality from Quijano and Mignolo, some South American authors, that say that the colonial experience goes beyond the colonial administration and is still embedded in our culture right now. And seeing that in Colombia, how we don't only live in a culture of war, but in a culture of not dialoguing, of having sort of monologues instead of dialogues. I started to work in this organization called Embrace Dialogue, which originally called Rodeemos el Diálogo. And I have been working for the last 4 years there. Its aim is to support the negotiated end of the armed conflict in Colombia and to promote a culture of dialogue in the world. And it's this culture of dialogue that I found really interesting and really unique, at least in Colombia, but also I haven't seen anything else here in my time in the UK. And it invited me to reflect on the challenges of this culture of dialogue in different situations and through the colonial perspective. So for my master's, I had to do a placement where I could reflect on the challenges of put the colonial theories at work. And I decided to do it and embrace dialogue and carry out a research about this culture of dialogue concept. And I divided this research in 3 stages. The first one was to do an archival research of the organization. I also did some interviews, semi-structural interviews with the members of the organization, and then a literature review and participant observation of their events. I do it for 4 months here in the UK. I also went to Colombia for a week. And methodology-wise, it's not only this, using these 3 methodologies, but I also had the challenge of doing this through a post-colonial perspective. So I always was thinking how to deal with the power imbalances and maybe how the insider-outsider binary was maybe not that true. I was going from insider to outsider, etc. So the paper is divided in 3 sections. Firstly, I did a context about the violence and armed conflict in Colombia as a legacy of colonialism, because we, in Colombia and internationally, we hear that the conflict is due to the lands, to the lack of state presence, inequalities, but we rarely reflect on how this has its roots in a colonial history, maybe because we had the independence 200 years ago, so it's not something in Latin America in general that we reflect much as in Africa or the Middle East. And in this first section, I sort of make visible this violence that comes from the colonial ruling that is still taking place. Then on my second section, I wanted to reflect about dialogue theories. I went from the Greeks and Socrates to Marx, Hegel, and I reflected on how this dialectic process that the Marx and Hegel say is seeking always a resolution or closure, but that dialogic process, on the other hand, focuses on the exchange per se, and not on a resolution or closure. And I came out with 3 conditions that a dialogue should have for it to be focused on the exchange. First, the will of the people, no coercion or pressure. Second, a safe space, so a neutral location or a trust and a trust environment. And third, equity, meaning no power relationships taking place. And this, I linked it with peace building in the way that it seeks to not resolve conflicts, because conflict, I think, is a positive thing to have, but to transform conflict in a way that it isn't violent, because that's the issue, either materially or symbolically. And I wanted to reflect critically about dialogue, because we always hear dialogue as a positive thing, but seldomly we reflect about its dangers or its like challenges. And even if dialogue can build trust, reconcile traumas, expand the mind, make people more empathetic, dialogue and peace building, both as they are practiced, at least right now, they are Western concepts and they are Western practices. And they include a coloniality within them, of intervention from the north to the south, for example, of transition to democracy and capitalism, of normalizing markets, like that's mainly the target of these interventions. And it's done by professionals, mainly trained in the West. And this affects these three conditions that I have told you. But also dialogue, as is it very, it's seen very abstract and very positive perception, can be manipulated, can be instrumentalized to control, to silence dissent, to force agreements, for example, or to impose a point of view with a mask of agreement. So with this introduction, what I found in my research about the culture of dialogue, at least by how it is practiced by Embrace Dialogue, is that it is a set of actions and behaviors of collectively processing emotions, because I didn't say it, but this organization, Embrace Dialogue, focus on emotions more than like on concepts. And dialoguing, I think, is more than just talking about concepts, is processing our emotions collectively. So this culture of dialogue is about particular actions and behaviors of collectively processing emotions, self-reflecting, and humbly learning from the perspective of and experiences of others, that, when practiced regularly, become a habit, and a skill, and ultimately a way of living the world. These actions include carefully listening carefully, speaking assertively, and questioning one's own truths, and making our own position more flexible, respecting diversity, understanding that there are not absolute truths and there are different contexts and narratives and ways of seeing the world. The culture of dialogue, as practiced by this organization, has 6 principles: honesty, generosity, solidarity, respect, co-responsibility, and self-criticism. These 6 principles allow us to constantly question whether we put this culture of dialogue in practice, and makes the dialogue more equal and more productive. But also, practicing these 6 principles ensures that the existence of will, because we are generous and self-critical, of a safe space, because we are in the respectful and trusting environment with honesty, and of equity is possible. And this culture of dialogue, as we discussed in the first session here, it starts at the micro level, at the individual level. These actions and behaviors happens not only in controlled environments, although the organization and in Colombia there are a lot of spaces where dialogues happen, but it's more productive when it happens in the daily life, and when it becomes internalized and becomes a habit of the person doing it, and it then goes to the macro level when these people practicing it just by setting an example lead to others repeating that culture of dialogue. And when that becomes collective is what makes it a culture. And I think this concept of culture of dialogue could be the key for people to resolve their conflict in a non-violent way, and to address this structural colonial legacy violence that caused the armed conflict in this particular setting. But also, I think that it can be translated to a different settings than the Colombian, or than, for example, just an armed conflict, but other settings of disagreements. I think it could be a decolonial peace-building tool, and that's why I put it on the title and developing it in my paper, because it allows to make visible other ways of understanding the world, of living the world, which leads to an epistemic reconstitution where not only one epistemology leads the other or imposes truth to the others, and makes visible these others apart from the Western hegemonic one. Recognize the multiplicity of knowledge and experiences, personal and collective, and it is a metaphorical space within oneself and collectively, where we practice, or where all places of enunciation and thought have a space. But it has a lot of challenges also, at least in Colombia, to reach a wider and more diverse audience, and to openly question coloniality, because if it questions violence, but it doesn't make that link visible, and to leave the comfort zone and support more openly decolonial initiatives and struggles that already exist in Colombia and in other settings. And with that, I want to link it to what is happening right now at Colombia. I don't know if you are aware, but we are through a period of national strike since the 21st of November. It's been a week now, and people are asking for fairer conditions. And this is, I think, because two things. First, once the armed conflict with the FARC ended, people could pay attention to more structural issues that are affecting their daily lives. And second, the peace process that took for 7 years set the seed for Colombians to express their dissent, to dialogue, to say the seed for the culture of dialogue. And there's still a long way to make it like a culture, but people taking the streets is a first. It's an example of how people in Colombia are changing. But also, the state has responded in a violent way. It has also, there's already, I think, 3 people dead from the state repression. And the president said that he's calling for a national dialogue. He's using the word dialogue, but his intention is not to dialogue at all. So he is an example of the dangers I mentioned before on how he is instrumentalizing dialogue just to calm the strike, but keep his oppressing ways in the system.